3D modeling, animation, and rendering software has been around for a long time now, but it's still crazy hard to work with for the average artist. Well, the good people at Adobe are trying to do something about that with their application, Dimension. In the next few minutes, we'll take a look at how to use Dimension to create convincing stills. But more than that, we're about filmmaking after all. We'll show you how to use Dimension as a starting point for visual effects shots. Dimension is designed to be simple, and it is. Of course, we're going to bend it to its limits, but more on that later. There are three basic pieces to the process. You supply a background, then you add a 3D model, and finally, you light the thing. To begin, drag a background image into Dimension's main window. It'll appear in the main canvas and you'll see the following dialog window. To have the final image resolution match your background, set the resizing option to Image Size. Three checkboxes offer to create an environment map image that can be used for image-based lighting, create a light to match the color and direction of sunlight in the shot, and finally, to position the virtual 3D camera to line up with the perspective of the real-world camera that actually took the shot. For the most part, you'll want to leave things as they are and click OK. Let's take a look at the interface. Its center stage is, of course, the canvas, currently showing our background image. To the left of it is the Assets pane. Here you can access various stock 3D models, a range of material presets, background lighting presets, and alternate backdrops. Adobe Dimension uses machine learning, a form of artificial intelligence, to attempt to line up the virtual camera with the shot. Usually it requires some degree of tweaking from its best guess. So on the left-hand edge of the interface are tool buttons for doing just this. The first is the Horizon tool, probably one of the most important adjustments. Because our image has such clear edges on the kitchen counter, Dimension has correctly set the horizon to match the vanishing point, as we can see if we manually visualize two of the diagonals meeting. Now if the horizon line was off, we could simply drag to adjust it. There are also tools for moving the camera position closer or further, panning and rotating. Before you begin experimenting though, bookmark your current camera position using this button in the upper right. That way you can come back to it if you mess things up. You can then use the tool buttons on the left or simply middle mouse drag on a 3-button mouse to dolly, right mouse button drag to tumble or rotate, and scroll the scroll wheel to move closer or further away. So now that we have made a mess of things, we'll go back to our previous alignment by double-clicking its bookmark. Now it's not very often that you'll find exactly the item you're looking for in the presets, but let's play along for now. We'll drag a disposable coffee cup into our scene. This is probably a little bigger than your typical 20-ounce venti latte, so let's shrink it down a bit. We'll click the lock button to make sure it scales equally in all three axes, X, Y, and Z, and drag across one of the axis labels to adjust the scale. Still a little monstrous, but we'll keep it large so you can see what we're doing in this demo. To move the model around, select the Move tool or press the V key. To move in one direction, drag an arrow. To move along the ground plane, drag the pink corner joint. Unless your object is a hovering flying saucer, you don't want to move it vertically or it won't have a ground contact shutter when you render. Next thing we want to do is give appropriate materials to our cup. From the materials list, we'll add white plastic to the lid and cardboard paper to the actual cup portion of the model. Notice that you can access specific settings for the various scene elements by selecting them from the scene list at top right. Use the disclosure triangles to reveal any hidden information like the added materials. Okay, what you're seeing in the viewer is only a rough preview. Click the Show Render Preview button to reveal a progressive refinement of the scene. Click the arrows to enlarge it. Note that it may take a little while to initially show the model as it calculates some settings. Now that we see a preview of the cup, we can play with the material settings sliders to get the lid looking the right kind of shiny. Select the lid layer, then expand its disclosure triangle to reveal the white plastic material. Roughness adjusts the spread of the highlight. Now it's time to try and match the lighting accurately. We'll close the render preview for now. First, we'll work on the direction of the sunlight shadow. Click Environment in the Scene pane and then expand the Sunlight section and increase the intensity to make it easier to see the shadow direction. In our case, the shadow falls off the edge of the counter. That's something we'd need to later remove in Photoshop. If we look at the shadow direction of the dining chairs at screen left and the coffee table at screen right, we see that they're actually in opposite directions. It's the result of sunlight entering through windows from both sides of the frame. Unfortunately, Dimension only supports one primary light source and shadow, so we'll go with the light source from screen left and angle our shadow appropriately. Well, we've done about as much as we can in the standard preview, so let's switch back to the render preview. We'll adjust the intensity of the lights in a moment, but first we need to account for the reflection in the granite countertop. We'll open the ground plane section and adjust the reflection opacity until it looks appropriate. Polished granite's pretty smooth, but we'll add a touch of surface roughness as well. Finally, we adjust the intensity of the sunlight and the ambient environment lighting until the cup feels more integrated into the surrounding picture. Okay, so this is all very cute and would be great if we wanted to create a bunch of product shots, but how does this apply to video? Well, it turns out that Dimension does some things that are really quite tricky in visual effects. It estimates the camera position for a locked down frame, and it also estimates the lighting for CG objects we might want to introduce. If the camera was dollying around the scene, we'd have plenty of information to throw at a 3D tracker. But with a single lockdown shot or tripod move, there just isn't enough information for that kind of tracking. So let's see what we can do with Dimension and video. We'll start with a new shot. Suppose we want to add, say, this 1960s British police signal box model we downloaded from the web. We rendered a single frame from the video sequence, frame 19, and now we'll drag it into Dimension to create a new project. We'll repeat all the alignment process to make sure Dimension has correctly guessed the camera position. Next, we'll choose Import from the File menu. Dimension accepts models in the OBJ format. Once the model's imported, you'll see that it looks a little bland. That's okay, we'll add materials in a moment. First though, let's get it into position. We'll use the Move tool again to shift it forward, then switch to the Rotate tool to give it a little angle. Let's click the Render Preview button to take a look. Now we'll address the issue with those materials. You'll see several materials are already listed for the 3D object we downloaded. This particular model also included image maps, also known as decals. To use these, select the material you want to adjust. The main object here is called TARDIS, and it has a single material called Blue Paintwork. With Blue Paintwork selected, we'll click on its base color swatch. Now instead of using a single color, we can apply a decal or image map. Switch to Image, and then find the image that matches on the hard drive and drag it in. There are also special image maps for varying properties like metallic and roughness across the surface. You can experiment with attaching different image maps to different properties. For surfaces that don't have these decals or image maps, you can substitute a material preset from Dimension's library. There are presets for most of the common materials you're likely to need. Continue working through the list of materials on your model until every surface has a material applied to it. Once you're happy, it's time to head back to the Environment section to dial in the lighting effects. Let's start with the sunlight. Now, it's a very cloudy day, so there really isn't much direct sunlight at all. One way to learn about settings is to move them to extremes to see what they do. Shifting cloudiness to 0 creates an extremely sharp shadow, like you'd see in a cloudless day. Obviously, we want the opposite, a completely overcast, cloud-filled sky. This creates a very diffuse shadow, making its edge effectively disappear. Reflections obviously play a big role in this rainy day shot, so let's add them to the ground plane, adding roughness to simulate the unevenness of the wet road's surface. Let's also take a quick look at the contribution of sunlight by temporarily deactivating it. We'll talk more about this in a moment. Let's reactivate. Now that we have something worth using, we'll switch to the Render tab and render a full quality 32-bit float Photoshop file of the scene. Choose a render location, give the file a name, and away we go. The renderer will take quite a while at high quality, but when it's done, you'll be left with a Photoshop document with the 3D object on a separate layer to the background. As a quick extra step, we'll go back in and turn off the environment light, leaving only the sunlight. That way we can add or subtract the sunlight to give us control over the lighting balance between the two light sources without having to re-render. Okay, let's hop into After Effects to put the scene together. We'll start with the original video clip and create a composition from it. Next, we'll move in the timeline to frame 19. That's the frame we used as a still inside of Adobe Dimension to set up our shot. Now we'll bring in the Dimension render, being sure to import as a full composition so we have access to its layers. Drag it into our existing composition, and we have our police box. The render includes a copy of the background, so we need to remove that. We'll double-click to enter the TARDIS Beauty comp and deactivate all layers except for the actual rendered image layer. When we switch back to the main comp, everything looks the same, but we're now actually looking at the source footage, not the still from the render file. The problem with this source footage, though, is that the camera moves. Our single image render from Dimension does not. The good news is that it's a simple tripod move, so the perspective of the police box won't change, just its position. A simple track will take care of the movement. First, we create an After Effects null as a target for the tracking data. Then we select the footage layer and perform a simple track motion. We'll track one of the cars located just behind where our object will be inserted. We're currently at frame 19, so we'll track from there to the start, and then from frame 19 to the end. After Effects automatically chose our null as the motion target, so we don't need to set that. So now we simply move back to frame 19, remember that's the frame we used for our Dimension render, and parent the TARDIS Beauty layer to the null using the parenting pick whip. Because we parented at frame 19, the position of the Dimension render stays locked at that frame, but as we step through the timeline, we'll see that at other frames, the render translates to keep in step with the camera move. The motion's correct, but the police box looks way too crisp relative to the rest of the footage. First, we'll add motion blur. It's subtle with the slow camera move, but important nevertheless. Then we'll add some camera lens blur and try to match the softness of the rest of the shot. Remember that extra sunlight render we made? Let's import that render and then drag only the render layer into our TARDIS Beauty comp. we'll change the blend mode so we're adding this light source on top of our main render. Now, by simply adjusting the opacity of the layer, we can vary how much more sunlight is added on top of the environment lighting. Finally, we'll do a little color correction before adding a match grain filter to add some camera sensor noise over our CG model. Now, there are plenty of other tweaks we could do to add more realism. For example, we should see some kind of shadowing and reflection as the woman gets close to the side of our object. But for an automatic effects shot created with an app you got for free with your Creative Cloud subscription, not bad at all.